over 40 minutes, but worth your time. Mirrored from The Last American Vagabond.
The focal point of the origin of where this began has been this has been one of the main discussion points for Trump's administration like a month into this. Still, ask yourself how that makes sense that they somehow knew then. Seems like they had inside information, doesn't it? Well, they likely did. Or let's just say they did. And here's why. And let's be clear. Here's one reason why. There's a lot of reasons that we've already gone over about why everything that was happening in that Wuhan lab in regard to coronavirus and bats was being driven by the U.S. government. This is basic and verifiable information. But what's interesting is certain people just don't want to put those things together, even though they're the most basic building blocks we can see. But as Raoul writes, DARPA's man in Wuhan. Now the opening subtitle reads, Michael Callahan's career. This is the individual we're talking about right here. Take a look. I have a feeling his face is going to be popping up a bit. His career began in USAID. Now, right off the bat, we need to remember that USAID, I don't know why it shrinks when I highlight it, USAID is just a vehicle for regime change. So with the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, these groups use they basically do what the CIA used to do in a clandestine fashion, right in the open. Using foreign aid, using food and different things as tools, as leverage to insert U.S. foreign policy and their directives and their policies on foreign countries and the peoples underneath them, or governments, I should say, and the peoples underneath them. So realizing that as far back as you want to go, by the way, that's pretty damn clear. So that should say something in general, right off the bat. But his career began in the U.S. aid and in the bioweapons labs of the former Soviet Union, advancing the agenda of the global bioweapons and pharmaceutical cartels. He would take what he learned there to execute a massive expansion of DARPA's biodefense portfolio, and today finds himself squarely in the center of the origins of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, we know that the biodefense agendas of this country, these are bioweapons. So says the creator of the Bioweapons Act, Dr. Francis Boyle. So says anybody honest enough to point out the reality and the contradiction of pretending to create vaccines for things that don't exist yet. It's clear. So anybody involved in these things, it needs to shade your opinion of them in a certain way. That's my take. Now, there's a lot in this article about history in regard to this person, Michael Callahan, in his history in this country, and dating all the way back to I forget the date where we started discussing his history, but I'm going to jump past most of this that I really hope that you will take the time to read, because I wanted this, to avoid being a 4-hour show, I want to jump right to the point here in regard to the ties to Wuhan and how I think this connects back to the origin. But all of this is incredibly relevant for you to read. Now, this says, as was the case for several individuals within a certain tight-knit group within infectious disease and biological weapons circles, 9/11 and the subsequent anthrax attacks changed the course of Callahan's career. And this is interesting to think about in regard to the people we've already discussed. You know, the Cadlecs, these kind of individuals that are tied, and I mean, Jerome Hauer, crazy, obvious ties to 9/11, the anthrax, and all this stuff. 9/11 and this bio-focus after this created these people, in essence. Now it says, spurring his meteoric rise in both the public and the private sectors. Robert Danzig, whose name should be familiar, Clinton's Secretary of the Navy, credited Callahan with being, quote, extremely good at connecting the military environment with mainstream public health. Right, because that's what all Americans want, right? Clearly this is what we're seeing today. Very interesting. Now, it says, in 2017, the U.S. Department of Defense awarded a $6.5 million contract to the company called EcoHealth Alliance. Now, we've talked about them quite a bit. This is the middleman, essentially, between the U.S. government and the funding of the Wuhan lab, as if we didn't, the idea being that they pretended they, stopped their gain of function research, even though it's clear that both, not only did it not stop even in the United States, but that the idea of outsourcing it to another country, funding it, having your people there to control it, in no way, the point was to make it seem, in my opinion, that it was somebody else responsible. The idea that this is the same reason that they outsource their torture prisons in Yemen to the UAE, that is still conducted by the U.S. government, because they can say, well, we're not doing it. Well, we're not. We just see, this is what they constantly do. History is rife with examples like this. Now, they created the $6.5 million contract to a company called EcoHealth Alliance to carry out research on, quote, the risk of bat-borne zoonotic disease emergence in Western Asia, which, again, has been ongoing years before this. Like we pointed out many times before, the actual material that was used at the Wuhan lab in regard to this came from North Carolina University. All of this stuff ties back to groups in Harvard. I think it's incredibly relevant to discuss someone like Charles Lieber, who was working on nanotechnology that could mimic viruses. Interesting. And he gets weirdly tied up in this as if he was connected to this in the beginning, having Chinese people being caught trying to smuggle Chinese, U.S. biomaterial into China. There's obviously a weird connection there, but this goes all the way around. Now, journalist Delanya, which I'm horrible at her last name, I've mentioned her in the past, who had a huge story, uncovered the Pentagon Project, which focused on genetic studies on coronaviruses in 5,000 bats collected in Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Jordan. Now, I've already talked about Georgia, and specifically Delanya's work, showing that there's people all around places in Georgia, the country, not in the United States, that are openly saying that the U.S. experiments happening in the area are causing people to get sick. And this is a BSL-4 biolab. There's places all over the world like this. Dr. Boyle himself says that every single one of these Ebola outbreaks in Africa has been within a stone's throw of a U.S. biowarfare lab. And I've already shown you that with this recent Ebola, the last one. But says that she also detailed the multiple covert activities being carried out by the U.S. government, such as American diplomats trafficking in blood and pathogens, which is a really interesting story that I hope you'll look into more, which shouldn't surprise you at all. This was, as they said, for a secret military program, as well as an instance in which a breakout of hemorrhagic fever in the area immediately surrounding the center was traced back to experiments being carried out by the Pentagon scientists on tropical mosquitoes and ticks. How many times do we need to see that before we start to realize who the culprit is here? That's not to say that other governments aren't doing the same things, but I can't see another government that had 3 leaks or 1 leak every 3 days for 7 years straight. Now, I keep saying that, and I hope you guys will look at it, because I've shown it, I think, 3 times on this show. And I bring it up all the time when I just kind of think of it off the top of my head, but the CDC itself has confirmed this. It's not hard to look up. I forget the exact dates. I think it was 2007 to 2000 something. They had 1 leak. Oh, so that would have been, anyway, they had one leak every 3 days for 7 years, talking about BSO-4 labs, Ebola, coronaviruses, HIV. All kinds of things that they have there. Think about what was leaking out. So here we are, staring at another example where one of these exact things, a breakout of hemorrhagic fever, was right around their center and traced back to Pentagon scientists and their biomanipulations. But don't worry, it was all for your safety and vaccines, right? Keep telling everybody that. Now, it says, not coincidentally, EcoHealth Alliance, remember the middleman between Wuhan and the U.S. government, had previously received a $3.5 million grant from the National Institute of Health in 2014 to study coronaviruses in bats in Asia. This particular study was carried out in partnership with scientists at none other than the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Now, we've already talked about this too. Now, I'm going to get into in a moment the breakdown of the hierarchy of NIH, NIAID, Health and Human Services, because I'm really tired of everybody pointing to Fauci as the only one involved. Clearly, he's involved in all of this. Clearly, he's at the top of this problem, but there's a lot of people above him, right? He's an NIAID. NIH is above him. He has a boss there. There's a boss above them at Health and Human Services. His name is Alex Azar. Now, that guy reports right to Donald Trump. So what are we talking about here? Right? There's clearly a hierarchy here, where if anybody was making decisions in this chain, it would not be a secret. So as we keep pointing and saying Fauci bribed them or Fauci gave them money, it's not Fauci. It's the government of the United States. Right? That's what we have to remember. Now, on the point here, and I'm going to get into more of that in a moment, but that, again, does not mean Fauci is not responsible. He is very clearly tied up in this. That what it means is it's not only him. And clearly, the administration behind him is also culpable. Like, it doesn't matter. You can't keep pointing back to other administrations and saying, oh, 4 years ago, these things, you clearly were aware of these things because the U.S. government, while Trump was leading it, reapproved these things. So let's start pretending like this is not something that Trump's administration was just as much involved in. Now, the $3.5 million grant, as I understand it, actually only amounted to something like $600,000, but that's only what you could prove actually went there. And I did this on the show. But that's coming from the NIH, so take it for what you will. I don't know why it seems lessening the amount might seem beneficial to them, so it doesn't look like there was as much involvement, so maybe that's a lie. At the end of the day, it's very clear that that did happen. The funding, the grant in the beginning, and that it was carried out in partnership with the U.S. government. Now, it says, after a few years, bouncing, now here, I keep forgetting that for people that are getting tired of only staring at the screen, I'll try to jump back and forth. I personally find that people like to be able to see it when I'm reading it, but we'll see. You guys comment in the comment section, you tell me. Now, it goes on to say that after a few years bouncing from one former Soviet lab to another. Now, also remember that the idea of the Soviet labs and where... I mean, in every sense throughout history, the U.S. government, I've went over this before, has kind of grabbed the worst of the people they say they're fighting and taken it into their own. Whether it's the Nazi scientists in regard to Project Paperclip, or Dr. Ishii and his bio-warfare manipulations from Japan, it's the same kind of thing. The same thing happened after the Soviet Union, and it's weird that we can't recognize what that shows us. These people are capitalizing on the things that they pointed to justify overthrowing countries. Does that mean, I mean, that shows you clearly that it wasn't even about the thing they were trying to get you morally worked up about. Oh, it's so evil they're doing this thing that we're then going to use later. Ha ha ha, right? I mean, it's clear that they didn't really care. They cared to make you feel morally outraged. Because at the end of the day, I like to believe that American people are good. I mean, why would our government go to such great lengths to pretend that it's good? If it wasn't for the people wanting it to be good. Right? That's something that Caitlin Johnstone pointed out a while back, and it made sense to me. I think Americans genuinely want that, and that's why they're constantly pretending to be that. But, as it says, Michael Callahan, after the bouncing from Soviet labs, would return to the United States with a head full of new ideas and a brand new job at the Pentagon's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, where he could put it all to use as director of the agency's biodefense therapeutics portfolio. Now, it says, in the space of just 7 years, from 2005 to 2012, Callahan would expand DARPA's biodefense portfolio from $61 million to $260 million per year and launch 8 programs that would generate 9 investigational new drugs, or INDs, and 3 new drug applications with products in market, including, this is the important part, an injectable fungal treatment. Oh, excuse me, that's the next part, the important part. That's important because, as you can see, it's interesting. Gilead is the one they're pointing to, which has generated over $6 billion. Now, Gilead is a group that was obviously tied up in regard to the anthrax discussion. Rumsfeld made millions of dollars during that entire thing because he had tied with Gilead. I mean, the conflicts of interest is constant in this country, and we just don't seem to care. Of course, unless you're some small guy in a mom-and-pop store, oh, you can't allow that. That's just unjust. But, of course, if you're a billionaire and you've got big corporations, well, that doesn't count for you. Now, it says 2 programs in particular, developed by Callahan while at DARPA, would later play a crucial role in his future involvement in the broader story of COVID-19 and the vilification of China and the advancement of global vaccine regime. Now, this is where it gets interesting, and this is what you find out, that the origin story ties back to usual suspects. People that work with DARPA or USAID or are funded by them. So that doesn't necessarily mean, even at the surface level, that they were paid to lie. But that has to be an honest question. I mean, even when I started out today, before I even started, somebody in the chat was saying, you're a Chinese shill, which is just outrageous. I mean, the point is, before I even talk about it, by the way, so that means they don't even care about the information. If anyone anywhere is saying Wuhan didn't start the war, then you're just a shill. That's called a lack of intelligence, right? You're choosing to believe in something because you want to, not because it's actually verified. right? That's what children do. Now, in this case, we're staring at evidence. Doesn't mean we know it started in Wuhan. Doesn't mean we know it started in the United States or anywhere else. It means that at the end of the day, we see evidence showing that there are clear financial ties back to the U.S. government, to the very people who started the narrative. That has to be considered. And if you think that's being a shill, well, then you go back to your echo chambers, because you're never going to find any truth if you're not willing to consider things that you don't want to look at. I mean, we all have people that we believe in. We all have people that we want to trust. At the end of the day, you still have to be open to things that may paint them in a bad color. If you're not, well, then you're never going to be open to truth. Now, it says the Accelerated Manufacture of Pharmaceuticals, the program, was created by Michael Callahan in 2006, barely a year after he first came on board as DARPA's portfolio manager. Its purpose was to find technologies that could, quote, radically accelerate the manufacturing of protein vaccines and protein-based therapeutics. 2006, with the goal of revolutionizing protein therapeutics and vaccine manufacture through the private sector. Now, again, notice something that we're now seeing justified by COVID-19 that they were trying to do long before that. Now, as I keep saying, any number of these things, whether it's the AI plan or the things that they had before that they're now justifying with COVID-19, one of them anywhere could just be coincidence. Right? I mean, we could argue, well, sure, they've been trying to better vaccines or make them safer, blah, 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 for a long time, sure. But when you add them together, think about that. When you add them together and you got 15, 20 different things now that were all being pushed before, and we're all being pushed under different guises, and now suddenly we're not being sold as, oh, well, now we can use it for COVID. No, we're being sold as this is for COVID-19. And if you don't even care to look, they're telling you it was made for COVID-19. That is the illusion. That's what we're staring at. Now, it says this is from 2007 to 2009. The seminal 180-page report that resulted from 2-year deep dive into the U.S. government procurement and manufacturing methods for medical countermeasures. That's what it was, MCMs. Now it says, it was called Ensuring Biological Advancement, Development, and Manufacturing Capability for the United States Government, a summary of key findings and conclusions. Guess what? This was led by Tara O'Toole, Thomas Inglesby, people we've already discussed, individuals key to the Dark Winter PSYOP, right? The prediction, just like we had Event 201, that turned out being exactly what actually happened. Every time I talk about that, it's a joke to me. How many times can they verbatim predict, quote unquote, predict what's going to happen? They told you what they were going to do and then did it. I mean, and the evidence is obvious in regard to the anthrax lie. They even tried to frame Iraq. They didn't work. Then it was traced back to Fort Detrick, and they passed it off on somebody who was innocent. You know, I mean, this whole thing is clear. Constantly ties back to the usual suspects. But it's led to the establishment of an entrenched biotech mafia in the halls of government. Big surprise. Now it says here that in 2005, just as he was getting ready to decorate his new office at DARPA, Michael Callahan testified before Congress with Ken Albiak. Callahan concluded with a chilling statement that summarizes the general sentiment shared by many in his circle. And get this. This is what he said. The dark science of biological weapon design and manufacture parallels that of the health sciences and the cross-mixed disciplines of modern technology. Potential advances in biological weapon lethality will, in part, be the byproduct of peaceful scientific progress. So, until the time when there are no more terrorists, always, right? That is always this lofty idea that we're somehow going to eliminate people who want to kill other people. Like, that's just the stupidest thing you can ever say. You're never going to eliminate terrorism. It's just ridiculous. It's the same reason you're never going to eliminate fear or danger. These things are omnipresent. There's always going to be people, including people like the U.S. government, who will use people like those terrorists to justify their actions. Even aside from that, there will always be people that just want to act out against people that are suppressing them. There will always be that. So, until that thing that will never actually happen, the U.S. government and the American people will depend on the scientific leaders in their fields to identify any potential dark side aspect to every achievement. Of course, when they don't speak up about DARPA and their own things, well, then you can trust that they're perfectly safe, right? I mean, this is the fake reality they're building for you. Now, it says Callahan would receive DARPA's highest commendations. Self-fulfilling prophecy. Prophecy, which is actually what it's called, was another program created by Callahan at DARPA. Now, this prophecy is where this is where it gets really tying in with some of the other things we talked about. Now, it says in layman's terms, the program proposed that, quote, viral mutations and outbreaks could be predicted in advance to more rapidly counter the unknown disease with preemptive drug and vaccine development. Weird how that's exactly what we're talking about now. And this is being justified by COVID-19, medical pre-crime. Now, Harvard University, where Callahan holds a clinical appointment, which I find very revealing, received a $19.6 million contract for a joint project with the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, Johns Hopkins being one that was involved in Event 201, University of Pittsburgh, and others. Now, King, I'm not even trying to pronounce his name there. This is interesting. Now, it says that another institution with close ties to Callahan, obtaining generous funding through the DARPA Prophecy Program, was this King Chulalongkorn Memorial Hospital in Thailand, which houses the medical university where Callahan is a visiting professor. Now, Dr. Supaporn, I'm probably ruining his name, let's just call him Dr. Chu, which is what his nickname is, from that hospital we mentioned, had been conducting research on viruses in bats for years, it says, and considered one of the world's leading experts on bat pathologies, Dr. Chu. I mean, if you can see it, it's a very interesting name. Watcher Palu Sadi. I'm not going to, I mean, I was probably horribly ruining his name, so Dr. Chu it is. Now it says, indeed, Callahan and DARPA had identified Dr. Chu as an asset in 2004. Callahan and the Thai doctor worked together on several studies, one of these funded by the USAID PREDICT project. Now, Callahan is not shy, it says, about crediting Dr. Chu with allowing the U.S. government to work on, quote, critically important global virology projects. Yes, so you guys, I'm aware. I had it off, going back and forth, guys. Thanks in the chat. Now it says, it was Dr. Chu, after all, who would find herself at the center of the narrative built around the coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan, China. Namely, that the People's Republic of China purposely withheld critical genomic information from the world at the outset of the pandemic in January. So, first of all, realize that a person who is clearly connected to Callahan, somebody who's praising, is the person who ultimately started the narrative around this. Now, that doesn't mean it's fake, understand. But again, you have to realize that connection. Now, for those, again, that are wanting to attack this as some kind of shill idea, this is stuff you can look up for yourself. It's very easy to see. Now, my point in bringing it up is that this should be something we should consider in the larger discussion, to show you that the U.S. has very clear influence over these people who are leading this entire narrative, or at the very least had created this narrative. Now, it says, according to PBS.org, a story from them on January 8th, a Thai woman returning from Wuhan was pulled aside at the airport over symptoms of a runny nose, sore throat, and high temperature. Dr. Chu's team discovered that the woman was infected with a new coronavirus. Dr. Chu herself had allegedly succeeded in, quote, partially decoding the genetic sequence of a virus by the following day and reported it to the Thai government. Right? This is what started it. A person who has clear ties to Callahan, who is an old school, an OG in regard to U.S. aid and the U.S. government and DARPA and all the stuff we're talking about here. So that's interesting, wouldn't you say? But it says the same day, a 61-year-old man became the first death in Wuhan after succumbing to a disease with a reportedly similar pathology. However, the Chinese government didn't report it until 2 days later, on January 11th, along with the virus sequences from the Wuhan Institute of Virology and its own CDC. And this is what, again, we remember sparked the accusations that it was delaying information, which it could have been, right? I've never said that couldn't have been the case. All I've offered is that it's kind of, it's a stretch to say that we know that's what happened. 2 days, let's not pretend like 2 days between then and now did very much of anything to stop what ultimately happened on the other side of the world. Right? That is the excuse. Even if they did hold it back for 2 days intentionally, that's still a ridiculous, grasping excuse to put your failures on other people, or your willingness to allow it to happen under the guise of a failure on other people, other governments. But we don't know is the point. So 2 days, and that sparked the claims that they were hiding this information. Now it says, the information about the outbreak, that Dr. Chu compared her sequence with the one later published by the Shanghai Public Health Center found it was a 100% match, making it the first officially recorded case outside of China and effectively dropping the first domino, which would eventually lead the World Health Organization declaring it a global pandemic 2 months later. So I find it very revealing. It's a person who has connections back to the U.S. government, people who were funded, getting money from the very people who are driving this narrative aggressively right now. Never doesn't mean it's definitive, but it should matter to you. Now, think about it in reverse, right? You show look at the money from Fauci over to Wuhan, right? Something that is not specifically Fauci alone, something that's coming from years before into Trump's administration, something that is very actually common around, like I keep showing you, there's other right now labs in China that are still getting funding from the NIH right now, but we're pretending like that's not as alarming, because that's just not the point. They want to keep their experiments going, but they want you to think it was China in this one location. I've lost my point. Now it says Callahan himself had been stoking the fires about China's caginess regarding its... that was my point. That you flip it around, right? You flip it around. Think about the argument, right? If you had somebody who was being funded by the Chinese government, which, by the way, you have examples of, that is enough for them to point out and scream about and say, look, this person's working for this. But if it happens in the reverse, well, then I'm a Chinese shill for pointing it out. That is inconsistent. That's intellectually dishonest. Now, Callahan himself had been stoking the fires about China's caginess regarding its lack of enthusiasm for scientific collaboration with the West as far back as 2018. Okay, so think about how relevant that is. Here's what he said in 2018. Jeopardizing the U.S. access to foreign pathogens and therapies to counter them, declared Callahan over reports that Chinese officials had concealed lab samples of H7N9, which he argued undermines our nation's ability to protect against infections which can spread globally within days. So ask yourself this. If in 2018, during Trump's administration, that they were openly saying, look, they're hiding things, and then continued to fund the research in China. That to me that's inconsistent at the very least. That to me suggests laying the groundwork or setting the stage for something you're going to achieve later. If you were concerned about them not hiding things, why would you, in that very year, continue your research with the very same people? Certainly something we should be asking, don't you think? Now it says, a man with Callahan's background never quite leaves the government. As he himself admitted in his alumni profile, I still have federal responsibilities to the White House, he says, for pandemic preparedness and exotic disease outbreaks. That's in 2013, which will continue for the near future. Now it says Dennis Carroll, a former USA Director of Emerging Threats Division, who had led the U.S. response to the avian influenza in 2005, would go on to create the PREDICT program, which was designed to predict viruses before they happen, which partnered with a nonprofit called EcoHealth Alliance to carry out its 9-year effort to catalog hundreds of thousands of biological samples, quote, including over 10,000 bats. The aforementioned PREDICT funded 2015 study on diversity of coronavirus in bats by Dr. Chu and Callahan also included Peter Daszak, president of EcoHealth Alliance, among its participants. This is 2015. Here's Dr. Chu working with Dr. Callahan and the president of EcoHealth Alliance in 2015. So what do you know? You jump forward 5 years, and suddenly Dr. Chu is the person who discovers it over there. Mr. Callahan is the person who... you have to see how it's very suspicious that these are the people that were in the exact positions to create the story. Now it says, EcoHealth's executive vice president, William Karish, links directly back to the very top of the U.S. biodefense establishment. As a member of the Assistant Secretary of Preparedness Response, Robert Kadlec's original Blue Ribbon panel on biodefense. Robert Kadlec, the person you saw in the beginning of this video, the person who was acutely tied with the anthrax false flag, with all of these things we've already talked about. Most of you already know, so I'm not going to try to rehash all of it, but Robert Kadlec is a usual suspect. The very person that was tied up with Emergent Biosolutions, which was interestingly tied in today with COVID-19. The person who was tied in with the anthrax vaccine that they knew was going to hurt people, which they lost a lawsuit proving they did know that. And yet, here he is, seemingly more, more at a higher level than ever, right? I mean, it's crazy that people like that who can get caught lying to you, hurting military personnel with vaccines they knew would hurt them, and here he is back in a high position. In fact, the sole person in charge of the Strategic National Stockpile. So it's interesting that Kadlec, of all people, ties right into this. Not really surprising at all. Links directly back to the very top of U.S. biodefense establishment as a member of Robert Kadlec's original Blue Ribbon Panel of Biodefense, along with Hudson Institute's senior fellows, Tevi Troy, who we also talked about. And, of course, Scooter Libby as well, whose pivotal roles has been detailed in the Engineering Contagion series, which you can find in The Last American Vagabond and goes through all this stuff. EcoHealth Alliance is listed as a partner of the Wuhan Institute of Virology on archive pages and its website, and was mentioned as one of the Institute's strategic partners, which shouldn't be surprising if you've already been following the story, because they're the middleman. But to see how they are connected back to the same people, you can see how them being involved in Wuhan, at the very least, is another connection to clear influence from the U.S. government and the people like Callahan, or any of the other people we're mentioning. Now, it says the relationship between the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the American biodefense establishment was advanced by EcoHealth Alliance policy advisor David R. Franz, former commander at the U.S. Bioweapons Lab, Fort Detrick. Let me say that again. The relationship between the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the American biodefense establishment was advanced by EcoHealth Alliance policy advisor David Franz, who was a former commander at the Fort Detrick Bioweapons Lab. I don't know how many connections we need to tie back to see, at the very least, a questionable scenario going on here. Franz was chief inspector on the 3 UN Special Commission biological warfare inspection tours in Iraq, because we know those people can be trusted, right? It's just like, you picked the worst resume for the kind of people we shouldn't be trusting, and it's literally throughout Trump's administration in regard to what's going on right now. It says, which included a young Robert Kadlec as a member of the team on the ground, and currently advises Robert Kadlec right now as a member of the Health and Human Services National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity. So the worst people of the worst are the people that are right now leading this. And Trump will tell you they're the best of the best, right? Maybe they are, in regard to some pretty alarming things. Now it says a renowned bat coronavirus researcher at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, who we've all heard about, Shi Zhengli, also known as Batwoman, was not only the first scientist to associate the novel coronavirus with bats, but was also the original source of the claim that the virus had escaped from the Institute of Virology. Now, when she mused in a scientific American article published in March that the thought had crossed her mind and hadn't slept a wink in days, worrying about it until the lab test results had come back, showing that none of the sequences matched those of the viruses her team had sampled from bat caves. Now, Zhang Li, at the center of all of these rumors, we've all heard this, including that she smuggled hundreds of documents out of China, but apparently all of these have been denied by herself. But what's interesting is this, like the Dr. Chu we've talked about, with obvious ties back to people in the U.S. government, Dr. Zhang Li has also worked with EcoHealth Alliance Peter Daszak, the other person involved with these are the 3 people we've just pointed to. So here, you have one of them tied back that is the person who diagnosed the first case outside of this. Here's the person who started the narrative from within. And guess what? She's also being funded and paid by these same people. Dr. Zhang Li worked with EcoHealth Alliance Peter Daszak on the bat-related studies. As far back as 2005, Daszak and Zhang Li were conducting research on SARS-like coronaviruses in bats. Right? This is being funded and driven by the U.S. government. Several PREDICT-funded studies on SARS-like coronaviruses and swine flu count with both Zhang Li and Daszak's contributions. Perhaps the most noteworthy of these is a 2015 PREDICT and NIH-funded study that she co-authored, entitled, as you might remember, A SARS-like cluster of circulating bat coronaviruses shows potential for human emergence. As that's being touted as the proof that China did it, you scratch barely past the surface and you find out, oh, wait a minute, that's being funded by a U.S.-created program with U.S.-created DARPA and USAID-tied people who are clearly, the funding and the directives come directly from the U.S. government. So in what point are we you could still argue that, it's in China. So clearly there is Chinese involvement here. But how in the world can you omit this entire part of the story? I'll tell you how. When you're trying to create a false narrative, when you're trying to deflect from people who are involved. And that's not honest. Now, in March 2020, Callahan was on board the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Pike on his way to a cruise ship off the coast of California to separate the sick from the healthy among 3,500 passengers of the Grand Princess. So in March, he was on his way out to the Grand Princess. Just think of the timing. In a few days, the World Health Organization would officially declare the coronavirus to be a global pandemic and spur the lurch into the new normal, where quarantines and masks and hand sanitizer would be peddled as unquestionable realities. Now, days earlier, NIAID director Dr. Fauci had come on Face the Nation, as we remember, in one of the first televised appearances to announce the implementation of the 14-day quarantine for all Americans. And this is as people were finding out about infected people on these cruise ships. It was going all around the media. Now, the State Department would issue a travel warning specifically for cruise ship passengers on March 8th, barely 3 days before the World Health Organization's official pandemic declaration. Now, here's what I find interesting. Callahan, as he says, ever the disaster entrepreneur, had struck while the iron was still hot in February and put on his rescue medicine hat, which was the company he founded in the 80s, to assist, quote, Japanese and U.S. health authorities tend to the sick aboard the Diamond Princess, also, which was being held in the Japanese port of Yokohama near Tokyo. And this is what he said, quote, there was no way this wasn't going to show up on a cruise ship first. This is Callahan speaking to the Miami Herald. He says, quote, cruise ships are the canary for disease outbreak that reveals these diseases on a grand scale. Now, I know we've had these in the past, but can you remember on the, what's swine flu, MERS, SARS, did they all begin on cruise ships? I don't remember that. I find it incredibly interesting that this person who seems to say that they start there was somebody who went to look at both of these ships during this time period. That's just an interesting point. Now, it says it appears that Dr. Callahan did not need the cruise ships to alert him about the nature or scale of the problem. That seems interesting. Already by January 4, 2020, 4 days before his esteemed colleague in Thailand, Dr. Chu, had run the genomic data and come up with a partial sequence, and a full match had been determined after China and the Wuhan Institute of Virology had released their sequences. Callahan had phoned his old friend, Dr. Malone, in New York with a possible treatment for an as of yet unknown disease, because that makes sense, during a cheap raw material ingredient that could represent a windfall should it work. Now, this is a part in the beginning that we didn't really get into, but it's about something that he clearly was invested in. And the point being, I don't necessarily mean financially, just, invested in general, in work. And the point is that he's calling about this in regard to something that he's invested in to push before we were supposed to know about what was going on. And of course, it appears that he didn't need these cruise ships to let him know that they were having a problem, and he was already on his way. I find that to be incredibly suspicious. Obviously. But the point that he's then reaching out to say, hey, maybe this will work for the thing that we don't know about yet, seems like he kind of knew before he was supposed to. Now, it says in March, Robert Kadlec wrote to Northwell's executive vice president of research, encouraging him to drop a contract proposal and a budget for this Pepcid trial. It's called Pepcid, or a different name for the drug was what he was pushing. This is in regard to Callahan. The proposal came back, was about $20.75 million short of what Dr. Malone, the group involved with this, would be getting the actual contract, but what they apparently wanted. Now it says, quote, we stepped in to do it on behalf of Northwell, which knows nothing about the federal contracting, according to Malone. But it seems that Callahan's Pepcid brainstorm, as they said, ruffled a few feathers at HHS. Former BARDA director Rick Bright, as you may remember, the one that spoke out about this in the beginning, cited this whole Pepcid fiasco, the fact that he was pushing this, as the prime example for how Kadlec was inviting violations of federal procurement law in the March 5th complaint. So even people within this, regardless of how you view Bright in this whole thing, were pointing out that this was weird or wrong. Maybe not saying that, look, he knew before he should, but the fact that this was just dishonest. But no matter how you look at this, whether you're talking about them, him apparently knowing about things before he should, and proposing a drug before he knew it was supposed to be happening in regard to these ships and helping them before they were supposed to be sick, or the fact that all of these people tie back to every single key point in the narrative so far. Funding from the U.S. government goes to each one of the people involved in creating the narrative about Wuhan. I mean, none of those things should necessarily be a slam dunk by themselves, but when all together, there's no way you can ignore that. There's no way, if you're honest, you can pretend that the U.S. government having funding to each of the people involved in creating the narrative is somehow normal, or at the very least doesn't create a possible conflict of interest in regard to telling the truth. I mean, this is again, I hope you will circle back and read this whole article for yourself, because there's a lot more in the beginning that gets into the history of this person beforehand. But the whole point of this is to show you that the story that we're being force-fed just doesn't make sense, because there's not enough to back it up. But then when you find out that all the people that are pushing that narrative, based on statements with no real verification, are being paid by the U.S. government, well, then you have to ask yourself a hard question.